Phil is Principal Developer Experience Engineer here at Netlify. He has a passion for browser technologies and empowering properties of the web, and loves to seek out ingenuity and simplicity, especially in places where over-engineering is common. So after more than 20 years of building web applications for companies like Google, Apple, Nike, and the London Stock Exchange, Phil has worked to challenge traditional technical architectures in favor of simplicity and effectiveness. He also wrote our Modern Web Development on the Jamstack, or co-wrote our Modern Web Development on the Jamstack ebook, which if you haven't had a chance to take a look at, you definitely should. So without any further ado, take it away, Phil.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nate. All right, I've tentatively shared my screen. I'm sure people will make noise if there's an issue seeing the screen. Please do let me know. There's, as Nate mentions, there's a chance for Q&A at the end. So if there are things along the way that are questions you want to ask, if you would hold those to the end, that would be super useful, so we can get on through. So before we jump in, I mean, Nate's very kindly given a nice intro there, but a tiny bit more context, just a little bit about me. As Nate mentioned, I was kind of doing stuff for the things like the London Stock Exchange and putting numbers on screens for traders, so kind of real-time data distribution back in the late 90s. And then I went into agency land. Then I was working in a couple of different agencies from about 2008. That work really involved figuring out how to work with clients with a broad range of stacks. You never knew what you were going to get when it came to the technology stack you were going to be working with. So I got a chance to experiment with lots of different approaches, lots of different architectures there. Around 2012, I started really embracing what I was calling at the time static websites. But really, now we kind of think of as Jamstack websites, mostly because I've found it as an opportunity to simplify the stack, have more confidence in the way I was building things, but also more companies were starting to emerge, or services were starting to emerge, that really elevated the way we were working with quote unquote static websites. So things were changing somewhat there. So I was really starting to push that in the agency I was working at, and trying to convince people that there was a real future for this kind of site. It wasn't until around 2015 that Matt Billman and Chris Back, founders of Netlify, coined the term Jamstack and started really pushing even harder on this message. And I was talking to them along the way then, and in 2017 I joined Netlify, and since then Jamstack has expanded further, and I've gone deeper into that stack as well, for sure. Along the way, particularly when I was at agencies, I was really advocating for Netlify, frankly. I stumbled upon it, and I was really convinced that a lot of the features there could help. So I did a lot of demonstrating to my colleagues, to clients and what have you, the way I thought we could use these features really for the benefit of our project. So I was advocating for Netlify kind of before I joined Netlify, and I thought that the features I found there really created a very powerful workflow, particularly since it would often solve common problems, common challenges I would have on projects. And I'm hoping that some of the challenges I kind of list here might be familiar to people, might be like pain points that people have, or areas that you've already had to work out solutions yourself. So hopefully some of these will be familiar. And I'll just read these through super quickly because we don't have a lot of time in this webinar. But kind of challenges that I often found on all kinds of projects with different stacks were how to bootstrap a project and onboard new developers into the project, how to do things like setting up continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines, and making sure that that all works seamlessly. Walking the path to production, making sure that we had the steel thread as early as possible on a project where we would know that we could get something deployed and out into the world, and hoping not to do that for the first time on launch day. How to then also do things like revert changes and kind of roll back things that have gone out to production. Provisioning multiple environments was always a headache for me. I often found that creating a staging environment, a QA environment, a testing environment, feature environments that were all perfect facsimiles of production was very difficult, very hard to kind of scope, provision, cost, and maintain. So that was a big pain point. as was previewing work with clients. That was often quite difficult to do in a real world way. And then there's also things like coordinating large releases and supporting language and locales. All of it is kind of common set of common challenges we expect when we're doing web development, I think. I could go and play down through a bunch of features that we've got at Netlify, like the Git integrations, atomic and immutable deploys, cache invalidation across a global CDN, hooks, events, notifications across the suite of features on Netlify, things like branch deploys, build previews, form handling, serverless functions, split testing, redirects. Oh, the list kind of goes on. And in the amount of time we've got, it would be a real challenge to pick through all of these. But I think we can demonstrate a bunch of them in a fairly short order. But 25 minutes or thereabouts is challenging. So I'm going to cherry pick a little bit. But what I would say is the fundamentals for what I'm going to show, and I'd rather show rather than tell, so I'll show some demos here. The fundamentals that all of these build upon is this model. So if you're familiar with Netlify, this will be familiar to you. But if you're new to Netlify, this might just be useful background. And that is that fundamentally what Netlify does is it will run a build in our continuous integration environment. And we'll do that based on either what assets you give us through an API, or we'll watch a code repository and pull those changes, pull the code from the repository. We'll run your build in our environment, and the output of that build will then propagate to a globally distributed CDN. That means that when the client comes along and makes a request via a URL, that resource is close to them. It's in an environment where it's optimized to be served very, very rapidly. And that's the model behind everything that we're going to talk about today. So just kind of keep in mind a little bit some of these challenges that are present in software and development at the moment, and we'll try and address some of them as we go, and then we'll kind of take stock towards the end. So let's first of all start with bootstrapping a project, and I want to show you a number of ways this will happen. This is the Netlify environment, and a typical way we would do this is we would create a new project from Git, which will go off and authenticate with my Git repository, my Git account, and let me go and search for repositories in there. I've created one for the sake of a demo called Speedrun today, and I could go through here and set it up and hit deploy, and off we go. I'm actually going to do something slightly different to that. Instead of that, I'm actually going to go to the repository itself. This is a super helpful feature if you're working perhaps at an agency and you need to bootstrap many projects, and you might have a scaffold that you use many times. The Netlify deploy to Netlify button here is a kind of a shortcut to what I was just showing the UI for. So if I hit that button, it hits a URL that tells Netlify what repo to install, please. And then I'll create a new repository name because I'm going to clone that repository and make a new instance of that. And now what Netlify is doing as I hit that button is it's cloning the repo for me into my my Git account. It's created a new site. I'll go ahead and I'll give it a new name so we can refer to that a little bit more easily. So I'll call that Speedrun Demo, because we're going to go fast through a few things here. And now behind the scenes, what it's done is it's gone off and started a new build right away. So we can look at the deploy logs here and watch it doing its work. And since, with this kind of project, we capture all of the dependencies within a Git repository. Netlify here can see those dependencies. It's gone off to install those dependencies for us. It'll cache those for future use. That's running the commands that it found in the repository to run the build. In fact, the site's already live, so we can go off and we can take a look at that. So it's a very simple site for the sake of a demonstration. But here we are. It's created, just a single page, but it's also got a couple of other things that we might not usually expect. These are serverless functions that have also been deployed for us. Now, you can't run serverless functions within Netlify's CDN. Actually, what's happening is these are being proxied to AWS Lambda. So we've done the deployment on your behalf to AWS Lambda. So we now have an API effectively created where this URL is hitting a serverless function. So just to prove that out, there we are. We can see like a dynamic response from those URLs. We can also create redirects to these functions, and redirects are a super powerful thing that we'll perhaps talk about a little bit later on. So there we are. We're off and running straight away. We've deployed a site. We've bootstrapped a project. So let's move on. Let's keep moving through this quickly. So how do we onboard developers, and how do we set up a continuous integration pipeline? Well, slight spoiler alert, we've already set up the CI/CD pipeline, but we'll look at how that works in a second. Let's look at onboarding new developers. So I've gone to our new repo that we just cloned by hitting that deploy to Netlify button and running our first build in our new site. But I'm going to go to that repo. I'm going to copy that and clone it down to my local environment. So this is very typical of perhaps how you might how you might onboard a new developer. So I'll go to my terminal and I'll just run git clone. There you go. So I will git clone, and then our repo, clone down our new repo, move into it, call it speedrun. There we are, speedrun demo. And I will run npm install to install dependencies. Now, this is exactly what happened on within the Netlify environment. So we're just doing exactly the same procedure. What I'll do now is I'll just go on into the repo, to my local repo in my code editor, and we can see kind of things we might expect. There's the package JSON, there's a TOML file, which is what tells Netlify how to behave. It tells it what command to run. I'm going to run the same command here so I can see the build running. It's just a little static site generator that I've got here. Once that's run, we should be able to see, yeah, it's generated a dist folder with our assets in there. And that dist folder is what Netlify, when it ran its build for us, propagated to the CDN. We can also run Netlify Dev, which is a facility to run parts of Netlify infrastructure locally. In doing that, we can see our web server is there. And in fact, the Netlify functions, which you'll recall have been deployed to AWS Lambda, we can run those locally as well. So those are hitting a local URL, as you see there, and our redirects and our serverless functions all work within our local environment as well. So this is super powerful when it comes to the development experience. Shashrika, yes, the Netlify functions are indeed on AWS infrastructure. We're kind of a layer and on top of that to give this kind of workflow. So what am I doing now? Well, I'm making a change to my local environment, my local code rather, just changing some styles, and I'll commit that change, Pinkify, and I'll push that back to the repo. And then what I should see when I go to the deploys is, here we go, a new deployment is happening. And that's because when we created the site, it was hooked up to the Git repository. So in fact, it's got Git hooks there that will trigger a new build whenever activity happens on the Git repository. And we configure some of that, configure that rather, along the way. And I can talk a little bit about that. So there we are. So now we've now deployed a change that we captured locally. We developed locally rather, and now that's being pushed up to production, showing that we've got our continuous integration environment already there. So okay, so we're a couple of minutes in here, and we've bootstrapped a site. We've bootstrapped a new developer, me in this case, locally in my environment, and we're pushing changes, and changes are flowing through to production. How about rolling back? Let's keep moving on quite quickly. So here I'm going to move to a different site. I'm going to move to a site that's got a lot more history. This is my own blog site, so nothing particularly remarkable. It's a blog. It's got some tweets on there. There's a tweet about this webinar. In fact, my tweets are pulled in automatically when the build runs, but otherwise it's just a static site generator that's making my blog, and I've got some kind of JavaScript kind of based search and what have you. But it's a standard blog site. But I've had this for a little while, so it's a good contender to look at the deploys. So if I move to the deploys in Netlify, well, this will be a little bit familiar because you know, we've started creating some other deploys in our other project there. there are a couple of interesting deploys just up here. You'll see the third one is what's published at the moment, but there are a couple of unexpected deploys above there. There's one that says branch deploy, one that says build preview. If you look at the comments, you'll notice that that's come from Dependabot. So actually, in GitHub, I've got things set up so that Dependabot is watching for security issues with packages and dependencies, and it's created a preview build of a pull request for me, so I can actually just check that out. This is a bit of a diversion from what we're really looking at here, but you know, I can see there that it's created a deploy for me for a pull request. So if I decided to merge that that patch that the Dependabot had made for me, this is what I'd see. So I'm kind of taking a glimpse into the future. Okay, so let's keep on moving on there. So let's look back through time. Yeah, let's go and look down through the previous deploy. So I've got lots of deployments here. If I go back to my first one, where are we? Kind of August 2016 for this particular site. So I can go and I can look at the build to see the build logs that ran. This is just the same as the first one we saw earlier on, but this is looking back through time. I can see this used to be a Jekyll site. It's no longer a Jekyll site, but that's fine. You know, all of these deploys are effectively atomic and immutable. I can preview the build that happened there, and you'll notice the URL. That's a unique hashed URL, and you get a unique URL for every deployment that happens. So those live on in perpetuity as well. So these are great for being able to review with clients and what have you. I can navigate the entire site. I can go and look at the navigate around the blog, and you can see I'm still talking about Jamstack then. But if we go back to the build itself, we can decide that if we want to roll back a change, we can simply deploy a previous deployment, because those live on. So if I click that and say publish, what's happening now is Netlify is propagating that change around the CDN globally. So if I refresh my live site, you see it's now serving the version from 2016. And I can navigate around the whole thing again, because the whole site, since it was an immutable atomic deployment with all of the assets there, is safe, and I can navigate around the entire thing. So my blog is now a time machine back to 2016. I think I'll revert that, if you don't mind. I'll quickly go back to deploys, go back to the more recent one, hit publish again, and within just a few milliseconds, since all of the assets are already around the CDN, we just toggle that, and we're back to the current state. So yes, this is just looking at my blog, but this is hugely liberating if you're deploying things, deploying your own products, your UI. Knowing that you can revert any change with just a couple of clicks is really liberating. Okay, how about provisioning and managing environments? How do we currently do that? Well, as I said, that often used to be a bit of a challenge, a bit of an overhead. But let's go and have a look at how we do this here. The first thing I'm going to do, actually, along the way, just looking at this example, just since we've got an opportunity to see what failure looks like here as well, this is actually really valuable. So I pushed a change at some point that didn't succeed the build. There was some issue with it. You can see that it's failed there. But the nice thing is that you'll also perhaps notice that each other deployment has a link where I can jump into that deploy and I can see what was deployed. This one that failed, I don't have that, because once it fails silently. Nothing is ever actually pushed to the CDN. It fails in the environment and nothing reaches live. So that's really valuable. I can go in and look and see why it failed. I think I was missing a resource, but that's kind of by the by. So let's go to our deployment configuration here. And what we're going to do, just for if you recall, we're going to look at provisioning different environments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the deploy contexts setting and I look at branch deploys. At the moment, it's only building what gets pushed to the master, or the production rather, environment. I'm going to ask it to build every branch that it finds in Git. So now, if I come back to my local development environment, I can let's make another little change here. Back in the index file, let's start adding some content. So let's just add a little section in here. So I always start with a joke. And oops. Hard to think of a joke. Maybe we'll populate that with an API shortly. We just made a little change here. Let's create a new branch. We'll call that staging. So effectively what we're going to do here is we're going to create a staging environment for all intents and purposes. So let's save and commit our change. So yeah, so I'm going to prep the UI for some lols, and we'll push that change. We'll have to publish our branch. Okay. But since we told Netlify to look for all branches now, what Netlify is doing is, just as we had for our production branch, our main branch, it's now creating a branch deploy rather than a production deploy from our newly created branch. And it's doing exactly the same thing. It's installing dependencies. It'll then run the build. And then once it's finished that, it will publish what it found on that branch to a URL which is named according to the branch. So in other words, we'll get the word staging in our URL. So let's go and have a look at that, our branch deploy. And there we are. You can see that we have a URL which is staging -- speedrun demo. So it's important to note that this tracks the head of that branch. So whatever we push to that branch will live at this URL. We can also address every deploy uniquely as well, but this is tracking the head of that branch. So this is wonderful for creating a staging environment that teams can review. You can share with clients. It effectively is in exactly the same infrastructure as the production infrastructure because it's all propagated to the global CDN. So that's the consistency that we want. But every build environment effectively is sandboxed because each one runs it in its own continuous integration environment. So there we are creating new environments. So we can see that they're slightly different. And then if we want to promote that to production, we build on top of the Git principles. So let's go across to main and we'll merge that in. We're happy with our new bit of UI. So let's just close the loop and get that deployed. Okay, I might skip ahead in the interest of time because I want to show you something else. So that was just going to merge, and then that would be pushed to master. That would be live on master as well. So this is a slightly more interesting one. How do you keep UIs and APIs aligned? Because you saw we were pushing things to AWS or using Netlify functions is how we refer to it. So we're creating an API, and we've created a UI here that doesn't do anything. How do we keep those in sync and be able to deploy to both and make sure they're always aligned? Well, I'm actually not going to do this in my IDE. I'm just going to do this directly on GitHub. Hopefully that won't trip me up too horribly, but let's see how we get on. Because in our repo, we've actually got some of our configuration there that tells Netlify where to find the functions that it needs to deploy on our behalf. That's part of our repository. We go and look and find those functions. There they are. But there's just one at the moment. It's called hello.js, and that was the thing that was just responding to whatever parameter I'd passed along and responding. There we are. This thing. But let's start adding another API effectively here. Let's add another serverless function. So I'm just going to do this right here. I'll call that joke.js. And I'm going to cheat and not make you watch me type it all, but I will paste in some code here, which effectively uses node fetch to call an API. It calls this site, and it'll send back some JSON data containing whatever it finds there for us. We're going to create that on a new branch and start to pull requests from that. Off we go. Just give it a bit of a name. Create our pull request. Now we're not quite done. We need to create some other things in the same pull request. So I'll go and do that. Let's go and have a look at the code. This is perhaps a little bit more efficient done locally in an IDE, but I kind of wanted to show how we can do this even directly from GitHub. So I'm going to add the dependencies that we need. So yeah, any build at the moment would fail because we don't have node fetch. So let's create that as a dependency. Now, when Netlify runs the build, the functions that it finds, it will see that, and the dependencies that it has here, it will package those up and deploy them, including their dependencies, across to the AWS infrastructure for us. So that should be what we need to populate that, to satisfy that rather. So I just spotted a question about deployed branches being indexed. So by default, Netlify sets a header at the CDN for all of our branches and preview deploys that stop them being spidered. You can also set canonical URLs, but no, they won't be spidered, they won't be crawled. Okay, so let's go and have a look. Let's create something, our local, so our client-side JavaScript that's going to go off and fetch the data from that API and populate the UI for us. Again, I've cheated a little bit here and written it already, but effectively it just calls our Netlify function, and the data that gets back from the JSON will pop into the UI. So I'm going to commit that to the branch as well. We'll add that to our pull request rather. Let's see how we're getting on here. Okay. So you can see that Netlify is already doing some work. It's trying to build it for us. And we can see that there's something that's failed. And that's because we'd created the pull request. So again, this is probably why I should have done it in an IDE, but we created the pull request without having the dependencies in there. So initially that would have failed. But we've added that dependency in now. Yeah, we can see, look, it's, yeah, can't find node fetch. So the error reporting is right here in the deploy logs as well, which again is really useful for diagnosing issues. And now we can go off and look at our preview build. So this is a build that happened on the deploy preview, on the pull request rather. This hasn't been merged yet. Now something's not right, something's not working. So we can try and diagnose that right here. Let's have a little look to see what that is. Well, the function, let's just check to see if that's there. On the URL that will appear on. Yeah, so we're getting data back from our API, if you like, our joke function, but something's not happening in the UI to make that work. So let's just double check what's happening there. Cannot set inner HTML of, so I think perhaps we don't have, there's our code. We don't have an ID on our element that we're trying to inject into. So let's just fix that. Go back to our PR. This is again showing kind of cockiness. I think local IDE development, this would all be very smooth, but nonetheless, I think it's useful to show the troubleshooting process. So here we go. So I'll add that ID to the element, push that to the add that to the branch. Another preview build will kick off. And each deploy preview, you'll see that deploy preview number 1. That's because it's PR, it's pull request number 1 on the repo. So we'll get a URL which is named after the pull request number, so we can kind of track that. So we need to wait for that to build, and then hopefully we'll be able to see that we've kept our UI and our API in step. Now, in the same way that I rolled back my code on my blog earlier on, let's see. Oh yeah, here we are. Okay, great. We're getting jokes, terrible jokes back with each refresh. So our UI is there, and then our API is being hit with each reload, kind of as we'd expect. So that's adding that dynamic element in as a enhancement, if you would dare to call it that for this. But yes, as I'm just kind of finishing this pull request and merging this pull request in, I should just mention that in the same way that each deploy for my blog was an atomic immutable deploy, so I could roll back to any point in time, the same is true here, where we've got both the UI within Netlify's environment, those builds all deployed and kind of retained, and also the serverless function. So being able to roll forward and back, have branch deploys, feature branches, if you like, for any new feature that has serverless functions for the API and the UI, all within the same repo, we can keep those things in step perfectly, and we can roll forward and back and step around in time. So there we are. So that is now kind of finishing that process and merging. I'm just seeing a question from Ethan. While you can pull API data on Netlify, is it possible to host your own API? So we'll perhaps dig into that a little bit more in the Q&A, but effectively here, yes, you could host your own API anywhere and reference that, of course. That's the nice decoupling and separation. Any APIs you want to host on Netlify, so to speak, those would be serverless functions. That's the way that we would typically treat that. Okay. So we're just about out of time. So the idea of trying to demonstrate how do you do multivariate testing seems a bit outlandish, but we can do it. I think we can do that in about 2.5 minutes, actually set up A/B testing. And so let's do that. The way we're going to do that is we're going to create a branch, this one called No Fun, and we're going to pull out our joke. We'll say never start with a joke instead of always start with a joke. See if this is an improvement for the experience or not. We'll take out a few bits and pieces. We'll also dull it down. Let's dull the color down, not the lively pink anymore. And we'll do the same as what we've done before. Let's just double check everything's looking happy. We can review things in our local environment. Yeah, no joke there, a bit gray. So we're comparing that to what's live. Okay. So we've got that, we're creating that in a branch. Let's push that branch. So this is building on the principle that we had before of branch deploys, remembering that all branches are deployed from the same environment. They're all served from the edge of the CDN. So the performance profile is the same for all of them. So with that in place, what we can do is we can go to, so yeah, there's our build working away. So while that's building, what I'll do is I'll go across to split testing. Oops, one more, there we are, split testing. And you can see that we've got some UI here that lets us choose between the branches. So our new branch hasn't finished deploying yet. We just have to wait for that. Come on. Any second, there we are, that's it done. So we could see that directly and see that in the URL. But what we want to do is we want to shape the traffic at the CDN between the branches without the users knowing it. So let's shape traffic between main and no fun. We can decide how much, how the split works, add as many branches as we like, and then start the test. Now what's happening is that at the CDN level, any requests that come in for this URL, we're going to serve one or the other. And we'll use a random number to decide which one you get with weighting that associates with the weighting there. Oh, there we go. So very fortunately, I hit that first time. So in an incognito window, you can see the same URL resulted in a different branch being served. Now we also drop a cookie so that, or the CDN rather drops a cookie, so you get branch affinity. So you always come back to the same branch, so you get a consistent experience. But there we are. That's split testing happening at the edge with no dip in performance along the way. And I've just turned it off and then refreshed, and I'm serving everything from master. Okay, so I've gone pretty quickly. We've covered a lot of ground, but just looking at some of the challenges here, we didn't get a chance to talk about all of them, but maybe some of that will come up in the Q&A. But bootstrapping a project, onboarding developers, setting up the CI/CD pipeline, getting something deployed to production, reverting changes, provisioning the environments, having a URL that you could preview with clients. We've done all of those things. We can talk a little bit about things like language redirects and how you coordinate large releases as well, if that comes up in the Q&A. But certainly that's all kind of within the realms of the kind of features that you see in Netlify. Just quickly for a bit of reference, in terms of sites and experiences that are out there using it already, many people will have encountered this. React.js is hosted on Netlify, and their kind of build process uses a lot of features, or their kind of development process uses a lot of these features that I've kind of shown. Likewise, Citrix runs all of their internationalized, localized documentation. It's a large project with many thousands of pages running in a similar way. Bit more consumer facing. Victoria Beckham Beauty is an e-commerce site that is built on Netlify, and behind the scenes it's using APIs for some of the e-commerce. We could talk a little bit about that. And likewise, this big hair brand from Unilever also running on Netlify, being able to make use of some of those features as well. I apologize, I've run a tiny bit long into the Q&A, but that's all from me. That's all in terms of the demo. I'd be very happy to jump into Q&A now. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen. And I do see there are a few questions in the chat already. So Nate, what I think I'll do is I'll jump into those first, if that suits you.
Yeah, that sounds great, man.
Cool. Okay. So okay, there's quite a few coming in. So let's work through these. Okay, so since we were just looking at split testing, let's look at what David asked. What sort of insights are available with split testing? Is it possible to integrate goals to decide which one is performing better? Okay, that's a great question. So all I've shown there is how you can shape traffic between two experiences. How you gather the data and how you run analytics on the data, that's something that's outside of what Netlify can give you. However, what we can do is we can plug into whatever analytics packages you're using. So, so Google Analytics, for example, what we can do is when we run the build for you, there is, in fact, I'm going to share my screen again. So forgive me, I'll actually show you where some of this lives. That's probably easier than just waving my hands around. So yeah, hopefully you can see, I'm just going to make this, there we are. So let's quickly just go off and look where I'm describing here. So what we can do is after we run a build, it comes out of the build process, and on its way to the CDN, we can do some post-processing. So we can do a bunch of things. We can do like optimizing of assets. Let's bring it down to, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Deploys, here we are. Deploy settings is what I should be in. So post-processing, here we are. So we can do a bunch of things. We can do kind of, we can provide friendly URLs. We can optimize the CSS, JavaScript, do lossless compression of the images. But the thing that's pertinent to this question is we can do snippet injection. So what you can say is you can choose where you put various snippets, and then you can add whatever HTML you want to inject into the page at that point. And critically, what you've got access to here is liquid templating of all of the environment variables that exist. One of those environment variables is called branch. So you can poke into your Google Analytics code here a dimension which is branch. And in that way, you can start building up your reports that vary depending on the branch. So it's kind of up to you to configure that in Google Analytics or whichever analytics package you're running there. But you can flag to the analytics which branch your visitors are being served from, so that way you can start to track those dimensions. So hopefully, Dory, that answers your question there. But it's a BYO analytics package for that, but we can inform what branch things are being served on. Sina, does Netlify provide a load balancer? Well, in fact, Netlify serves all of our sites from a globally distributed content delivery network. So yes, it's kind of like the mother of all load balancers, if you like. Since the sites are all pre-generated and they're serving assets that are built at build time rather than being built dynamically at request time, we can optimize the CDN so that it serves those assets in the best possible way and to the point closest to the users requesting it. So the CDN effectively is a giant global load balancer, if you like, that behind the scenes is getting things from the origin, which is Netlify's build, when the builds happen. So so the short answer to that is yes, it does. So let's see what's a good one to go to next. Luis, Can environment variables be set for each provision environment specifically? So yes, you can create something called build contexts. I'm going to stop share. I might share again from time to time. You can create build contexts, and in the Netlify TOML, which I showed at the very start, that had places where you could configure what the publish directory was, what the build command was. You can specify different commands for different contexts. So a branch by name, or any branch which isn't master or deploy previews. You can set things up contextually there. Now, we don't completely namespace all environment variables for you. So in fact, environment variables are available to each of the different contexts, but with your context configuration, you can choose to target different environment variables. So there are ways of doing that within your builds and what have you. That might change over time, I'm not certain, but there is a way to provide that, even though it's not particularly namespaced. So hopefully that helps. Build context is your friend. That's what you're looking for. Bogdan, do Netlify Analytics provide any stats for A/B testing, or do we use our own scripts? Yeah, so as we were talking about earlier on, so Netlify Analytics does exist. It's a slightly different approach to something like Google Analytics. Google Analytics runs as JavaScript client side based on user events and things that are happening in the browser, and then Google Analytics kind of samples those and then provides the data. Netlify Analytics is slightly different in that it's analyzing requests to our CDN. So it's actually file requests that are being reported. So that means that no, we don't currently reflect any of the A/B testing data there. So your best place for that is in the kind of traditional client-side analytics, such as Google Analytics. One thing that is kind of nice about Netlify Analytics, however, just as another reason why you might still want that, is that we can track failed requests as well. So since we're not building things based on JavaScript, events actually firing someone 404s by trying to request a specific thing, we can track those as well. So that's useful. That's not quite what you're asking for here. So when it comes to A/B testing, it's a BYO. Bring your own analytics package to get the insights there. Let's see. Werner, what Search.js is Phil using there? Oh, so Werner, when I believe you would have been talking about what was on my blog, where I had like the type ahead, the type as you type search. That actually is simpler than you might imagine. There's less magic happening there than you'd expect, since that site is built with a static site generator, and static site generators like apply data to templates. I also make a search index based on what's in all of my blog posts. So it just creates a JSON file. And I take out kind of unique, like repeated words and small meaningless words, but create a fairly dumb, but very basically effective blob of JSON, which is my search index. I just do that at build time. And then when the user clicks on the search button, the search link, I pull that blob of JSON in, and then I use some JavaScript string matching to do the UI that you'd expect there. You could use other things. You could use kind of Luna or Solar to be creating, Luna rather, or Algolia to be creating those indexes, and there's lots of facilities, but I'm using something that's fairly simplistic, but pretty effective there. There's another question. How does the client editing experience work? Okay, so this is a great question. It's a little bit beyond some of the scope of like the features that I'm showing here in Netlify, but it's a great question nonetheless. When it comes to Jamstack sites or decoupled sites that have content coming from an API, or indeed, let's take a step back, sites that are built with static site generators, where, you know, first of all, it's great to be able to write Markdown and then just generate all of the site. But as the person who asked this question quite rightly says, you know, what's the editing experience for the client like? Well, now we're able to use things like decoupled or headless CMSs for this, and there's thousands of them. Once upon a time, that was a slightly exotic problem, but now that's a really booming trade. So so now the editing experience for content which lives in a headless CMS, that varies greatly, but some of them are really rich and very expressive, but they all tend to perform the job of creating structured data on an API that can be pulled in at build time by the build, whether that's locally on your machine or in the Netlify CI/CD. So the editing experience kind of depends on what tools you're going to use for that, but they're getting better and better all the time. And I kind of like editing content rather than editing layouts, but that's probably my agency days creeping in there, because I'd like to protect the layout that the client paid so much for. So these experiences are great at decoupling that, so you get structured data being edited. We could probably talk about that for a long time. That's worth going to the Headless Commerce Summit to perhaps talk about that, which we could maybe mention later on. Okay. So I think I mentioned Ethan's question earlier on about pulling API data on Netlify. So I'm just going to mark that one done. What are Netlify plugins? Okay, so let's talk about that just for a minute or two. So what you'll have seen me running through there was a static site generator which ran in a build. You saw it running locally, and you saw it running in Netlify's environment. If we think back to that white box, that slide I showed at the very beginning that had the Netlify environment running the build and then deploying that to the CDN, that's the Netlify build environment, if you like. Now, until recently, the only code that you could run lived in that build context. So in other words, the only thing you could run was what you would script within your build. So it might be a gulp command, it might be make, it might be webpack, but it runs within the context of a build. What Netlify plugins allow you to do is reach outside of that build time. So you can now run code which interacts with other parts of Netlify's infrastructure, either before, during, or after the build. So a really good example of that, for instance, might be pulling content from an API. You can absolutely do that as part of your build, but you might want to do that before your build. And one of the advantages to doing that is that that would give you access to cache that content between deployments that happen on Netlify. So you run your build for the first time, you have a plugin perhaps that fetches the feed for you and stashes it and puts that in the place that your build expects to find it. And then every time you run a build from then on, perhaps we cache it you can configure how long you might want to cache that or keep that around. And then instead of hitting that API every time, the build runs super fast because the data's there available for you. Equally, for things like Gatsby, Gatsby has lots of optimizations for caching assets between builds. Netlify plugins means that you can step outside of what runs in the build context and stash things in the build cache and keep things around. So your Gatsby cache can be cached between builds as well, and you can access that because you've now got access to reach outside of just the build context. So you can build all kinds of things with the plugins, but effectively it allows you to run code that interacts with the Netlify infrastructure before and after your build runs. So hopefully that will help with that. We could certainly have an entire session on Netlify plugins, and I'm sure we will in future as well. Can we plug in? Are we doing? Nate, I'm just going to keep on going until you interrupt me and tell me to stop.
Man.
So
I will
just keep going. Great. So Michael asks, can we plug in tests to run in the build deploy process? For example, Gherkin or DQ accessibility tests. Absolutely, you can. And you could do this in a couple of places. You could either build that directly into your build. So the same build script that you run locally, which might run those kind of tests, that could certainly live within the CI/CD, or you could run that through a Netlify plugin, which is probably even better because then you've got the ability to run that after your build is completed. You could then do things. You could apply logic based on the results of those tests. So you could have a plugin which runs the tests on the deploy target, the output of the build. And if the tests don't meet a certain threshold, you can fail the build. So it stops no further and doesn't get to deployment. You could do all sorts of things with that. So yes, Cypress is another good example. I've seen lots of good examples using Cypress with plugins and as part of builds. We certainly have a variety of usability and language inclusivity tests and performance tests that run on Netlify's build, because Netlify uses Netlify to build Netlify. If you'll forgive me going a bit inception there, but we run exactly the same kind of things where we run tests and we fail our deployments of the UI and our blogs and what have you based on the results of that. So, so Michael, it's a very long answer where I could have just said yes. You certainly can. Does Netlify have an enterprise offering? Fantastic question. Yes, we do. We do indeed. If you go to netlify.com/enterprise, you can get details of that. There's a whole host of different advantages to that based on like dedicated infrastructure and support and a whole host of other things. You can also find information on the pricing page as well, but /enterprise is a place to go. For the CDN, is it possible to mask the cloudfront.net URLs to be a friendlier name, such as cdnexample.com? So let's think about that. Where are those URLs coming from? So I'm assuming that is talking about if we've done some post-processing and generated assets that we then serve from CloudFront. I'm not sure about masking them. Might have to come back to you on that one, Ethan. I might make a note of that and perhaps do a follow-up so I can give a more sensible answer. Others of my colleagues might have some input on that. So I'll leave that one as unanswered and I'll do a follow-up with that one. Can I, Todd, can I schedule a Netlify build with GitHub Actions? You certainly can, Todd. Yes, so anything that can speak HTTP, anything that can fire an HTTP post at any time can trigger a Netlify build. So the examples you saw me running there, those were listening to Git hooks in GitHub Actions, but you can also create deploy hooks, as we call them in Netlify, which are effectively a webhook, which would trigger a build. You can create as many of those as you like, and they're just URLs that if they receive a post, they will trigger a build. So yes, since you can create HTTP posts from GitHub Actions, you could absolutely configure it to trigger a deploy on Netlify. I use things like if this then that, which just feels a little bit cheeky using something like that to schedule events. I use that to watch if I've tweeted or posted something on Instagram or one of my other content sources is updated, to run a build which then pulls things in. So you can do all sorts with webhooks and that kind of thing. So, but yes, in GitHub Actions, you could absolutely do that, Todd.
Right. I think maybe just grab one more, Phil, and then we'll.
One more. Okay. I'll keep a stash of these and we'll try and answer them another time. Let's see. Okay. So there's a question about WordPress, and why don't I should answer that one, and then perhaps we'll wrap. So the question is, how does the WordPress hosting or sites work on Netlify? Well, the short answer is that you can't host a WordPress site on Netlify, because Netlify won't run at request time the PHP in the databases that WordPress requires. So it's not really an environment for that kind of hosting. However, the way that many people are starting to use WordPress is as a headless CMS. So in other words, hosting WordPress on either WordPress.com or in another environment, but not using that as the place that their visitors go, just using that as the CMS, because a lot of people like the authoring experience of WordPress. And you can expose the content through content APIs. Then you can treat those content APIs just the same as any other content source and have a build that pulls the content in at build time from those content APIs and then publishes them as part of the build. So the advantage of that is that it means that you're not going to overload your WordPress site if you get a ton of traffic. It also means that it's a little bit more secure because it's abstracted away from the URL for your sites, and people wouldn't know where that lives, so wouldn't be able to just attack that. But it does mean that you still need to host WordPress somewhere because you can't host it just natively within Netlify. So sorry for the disappointment there, but there are ways to work around that, and people are doing that more and more. And there's a bunch of services to help you do that and include WordPress content in your builds. Okay, so there's still a handful of questions there that I'm so sorry I didn't get a chance to answer, but what I'll do is I'll capture all of those and I'll see if I can either tweet out answers, or maybe I'll answer them on the Jamstack Slack. If people don't know about the Jamstack Slack, you can find that. You can just join that it's got an open invitation. So that's jamstack.org//Slack. Feel free to come and ask me questions in there. I hang out in there a lot. Thanks so much for sticking with me. If you made it through, we kind of went through a little bit longer than expected, but I'm very happy to keep on answering questions over in the Slack. And yeah, thanks so much for joining, and thanks for the attention. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil, and thanks everybody for attending. Again, we will be sending a recording of this out here in the next day or so. So thanks again, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot. Cheers.